Hop Frog, Edgar Allan Poe, published in 1849. I never knew anyone so keenly alive to a joke as the king was. He seemed to live only for joking. To tell a good story of the joke kind and to tell it well was the surest road to his favor. Thus it happened that his 7 ministers were all noted for their accomplishments as jokers. They all took after the king, too, in being large, corpulent, oily men, as well as inimitable jokers. Whether people grow fat by joking, or whether there is something in fat itself which predisposes to a joke, I have never been quite able to determine. But certain it is that a lean joker is a rah-rah avis tari. About the refinements, or as he called them, the ghosts of wit, the king troubled himself very little. He had an especial admiration for breath in jest. He would often put up with length for the sake of it. Over niceties worried him. He would have preferred rebellious gargantua to the zadig of Volatar. And upon the whole, practical jokes suited his taste far better than verbal ones. At the date of my narrative, professing jesters had not altogether gone out of fashion. At court, several of the great continental powers still retained their fools, who wore motley with caps and bells, and who were expected to always be ready with sharp witticisms at a moment's notice, in consideration of the crumbs that fell from the royal table. Our king, as a matter of course, retained his fool. The fact is, he required something in the way of folly, if only to counterbalance the heavy wisdom of the 7 wise men who were his ministers, not to mention himself. His fool, or professional jester, was not only a fool, however, his value was trebled in the eyes of the king by the fact of his also being a dwarf and crippled. Dwarves were as common in court in those days as fools, and many monarchs would have found it difficult to get through their days. Days were rather longer at court than elsewhere. Without both a jester to laugh with and a dwarf to laugh at, but as I have already observed, your jester, in 99 cases out of 100, are fat, round, and unwieldy. So that it was no small source of self-gratification that our king, that in Hop Frog, that was the fool's name, he possessed a triplicate treasure in one person. I believe the name Hop Frog was not that given to the dwarf by his sponsors at baptism, but it was conferred upon him by general consent over the 7 ministers on account of his inability to walk as other men do. In fact, Hop Frog could only get along by a sort of interjectual jant or jaunt, something between a leap and a wriggle, a movement that afforded illimitable amusement and, of course, consolation to the king. For, notwithstanding the protuberance of his stomach and the constitutional swelling of the head, the king, by his whole court, was accounted with capital figure. But although Hop Frog, through the distortion of his legs, could only move with great pain and difficulty along a road or floor, the prodigious muscular power which nature seemed to have bestowed upon his arms by way of compensation for deficiency in the lower limbs enabled him to perform many feats of wonder and dexterity, where trees or ropes were in question, or anything else to climb. At such exercises, he certainly much more resembled a squirrel or a monkey than a frog. I am not able to say with precision from what country Hop Frog originally came. It was from a barbaceous region, however, that no person had heard of, a vast distance from the court of our king. Hop Frog and a young girl very less dwarfish than himself, although of exquisite proportions and marvelous dancer, had been forcibly carried off from their respective homes in adjoining provinces and sent to our king as presents by one of his ever-victorious generals. Under these circumstances, it is not to be wondered at that a close intimacy arose between the two little captives. Indeed, they soon became sworn friends. Hop Frog, who, although he made a great deal of sport, was by no means popular, had it not been in his power to render Tripetta many services, but she, on account of her grace and exquisite beauty, although a dwarf, was universally admired and petted. So she possessed much influence and never failed to use it whenever she could for the benefit of Hop Frog. On some grand state occasion, I forget what, the king determined to have a masquerade. And whether a masquerade or anything of that kind occurred at our court, then the talents of both Hop Frog and Tripetta were sure to be called into play. Hop Frog, in especial, was so inventive in the way of getting up pageants, suggesting novel characters, and arranging costume for masked balls, that nothing could be done, it seemed, without his assistance. "Come here, Hop Frog," he said as the jester and his friend entered the room. "Swallow this bumper of health to your absent friends." "Here," Hop Frog sighed, "and then let us have the benefit of your invention. We want characters. Characters, man! Something novel! Out of the way! We are wearied with the everlasting sameness. Come, drink! The wine will brighten your wits!" Hop Frog endeavored, as usual, to get up a jest in reply to these advances from the king, but the effort was too much. It happened to be the poor dwarf's birthday, and the command to be drunk to his absent friends forced the tears to his eyes. Many large, bitter drops fell into the goblet as he took it humbly from the hand of the tyrant. "Ha ha 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 ha!" roared the laughter of the king, as the dwarf reluctantly drank from the beaker. "See what a glass of good wine can do? Why, your eyes are shining already. Poor fellow." His large eyes gleamed rather than shone, for the effort of wine on his excitable brain was not more powerful than instantaneous. He placed the goblet nervously on the table and looked upon the round of the company with half-insane stare. They all seemed highly amused at the success of the king's joke. "And now to business," said the Prime Minister, a very fat man. "Yes," said the king. "Come, Hop Frog, let us your assistance. Characters, my fine fellow. We stand in need of characters, all of us. Ha 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 ha!" And as this was seriously meant for a joke, his laugh chorused by the seven. Hop Frog also laughed, although feebly and somewhat vacantly. "Come now," said the king impatiently. "Have you nothing to suggest?" "I am endeavoring to think of something novel," replied the dwarf abstractedly, for he was quite bewildered by the wine. "Endeavoring?" cried the tyrant fiercely. "What do you mean by that?" "Ah, I perceive you are sulky and want more wine. Here, drink this." And he poured out another goblet full and offered it to the cripple, who merely gazed at it, gasping for breath. "Drink, I say!" shouted the monster, "or by the fiends!" The dwarf hesitated. The king grew purple with rage. The courtiers smirked. Trippetta, pale as a corpse, advanced on the monarch's seat, and falling on her knees before him, implored him to spare her friend. The tyrant regarded her for some moments, in evident wonder at her audacity. He seemed quite at a loss for what to even say, how most becomingly to express his indiscretion. At last, without uttering a syllable, he pushed her violently from him and threw the contents of the brimming goblet in her face. Poor girl got up as best she could, and not daring to even sigh, resumed her position on the floor of the table. There was a dead silence for about half a minute, during which the falling of a leaf or feather might have been heard. It was interrupted by a low but harsh, protracting, gnawing sound, which seemed to come at once from every corner of the room. What are you making that noise for?" demanded the king, turning furiously to the dwarf. The latter seemed to have recovered in great measure from the intoxication, and looking fixedly but quietly into the tyrant's face, merely ejaculated, I, how could it have been me?" The sound appeared to come from without, observed one of conjurers. "I fancy it was the parrot at the window, wetting his bill upon the cage wires." True, replied the monarch, as if much relieved by the suggestion, "but on the honor of a knight, I could have sworn it was the gritting of the vagabond's teeth." Hereupon the dwarf laughed. The king, too, confirmed a joker to abstract of anyone's laughing, and displayed a set of large, powerful, and very repulsive teeth. Moreover, he avowed his perfect willingness to swallow as much wine as desired. The monarch was pacified, and having drained another bumper with no very perceptible ill effect, Hopfrog entered at once, with one sprint, into his plans for the masquerade. "I cannot tell you what the occasion of idea observed here. Very tranquility, and as if had never tasted wine in his life. But just after your majesty had struck the girl, and thrown the wine in her face, just after your majesty had done this, and while the parrot was making that odd noise outside the window, there came into my mind a capital diversion. One of my own country's frolics, often enacted among us at our masquerades, but here it will be new altogether. Unfortunately, however, it requires the company of 8 persons and... Well, here we are, cried the king, laughing at his acute discovery of the coincidence. 8 to a very fraction. I and my 7 ministers. Come, what is this diversion? We call it, replied the cripple, the 8 Chained Orang Otangs. And it really is excellent sport, if well enacted. We will enact it, remarked the king, drawing himself up and lowering his eyelids. The beauty of the game, countered Hop Frog, lies in the fright it occasions among the women. Capital, roared the chorus of the monarch and his ministry. I will equip you as orangutans, proceeded the dwarf. Leave all of that to me. The resemblance shall be so striking that the company of masqueraders will take you for real beasts, and of course, they will be as much terrified as astonished. Oh, this is exquisite, exclaimed the king. Hop Frog, I will make you a man of you yet. The chains are for the purpose of increasing confusion by their jangling. You are supposed to have escaped en masse from your keepers, your majesty. Cannot conceive of effect produced at a masquerade by 8 chained orangutans, imagined to be real ones by most of the company, and rushing in with savage cries among the crowd to delicately and gorgeously habitated men and women. The contrast is inimitable. It must be, said the king, and the council arose hurriedly, as if it was growing late, to put in execution the scheme of Hop Frog. His mode of equipping the party as orangutans was very simple, but effective enough for his purposes. The animals in question had, at the epoch of my story, been very rarely seen in any part of the civilized world, and as the imitations made by the dwarf were sufficiently beast-like and more than sufficiently hideous, their truthfulness to nature was thus thought to be secured. The king and his ministers were first encased in tight-fitting stocking-necked shirts and drawers. They were then saturated with tar. At this stage of the process, some one of the party suggested feathers, but the suggestion was at once overruled by the dwarf, who soon convinced the 8 by ocular demonstration that the hair of such a brute as the orangutan was much more efficiently represented by flax. A thick coating of the latter was accordingly plastered upon the coat of tar. A long chain was now procured. First it was passed about the waist of the king and tied. Then about another of the party, who also tied. Then about all successfully in the same manner. When this chaining arrangement was complete and the party stood as far apart from each other as possible, they formed a circle, and then to make all things appear natural, Hop Frog passed the residue of the chain in 2 diameters at right angles across the circle, after the fashion adapted at the present day by those who captured chimpanzees or other large apes in Borneo. The grand saloon in which the masquerade was to take place was a circular room, very lofty, and receiving the light of the sun only through a single window pane at top. At night, the season for which the apartment was especially designed, it was illuminated principally by a large chandelier, depending by a chain from the center of the skylight and lowered or elevated by means of counterbalance, as usual, but order not to look unsightly. The ladder passed outside the cupola and over the roof. The arrangements of the room had been left to Propetta's superintendence, but in some particulars it seems she had been guided by the calmer judgment of her friend the dwarf. At his suggestion, it was that on this occasion the chandelier was removed. Its waxen drippings, which in weather so warm it would be quite impossible to prevent, would have been seriously detrimental to the rich dresses and the guests, who, on account of the crowded state of the saloon, could not all be expected to keep out of the entire center, that is to say, from under the chandelier. Additional scones were set in various parts of the hall, out of the way, and a flambeau amid 8 orangutans, taking Hop Frog's advice, waited patiently until midnight, when the room was thoroughly filled with masqueraders. Before making their appearance, no sooner had the clocks ceased striking, however, than they rushed, or rather rolled in all together, for the implements of the chains caused most of the party to fall, and all to stumble as they entered. The excitement among the masqueraders was prodigious, and filled the heart of the king with glee, as he had been anticipated. There were not a few of the guests who supposed the ferocious-looking creatures to be beasts of some kind, in reality, if not precisely, orangutans. Many of the women swooned with fright, and had not been the king taken the precaution to exclude all weapons from the saloon, his party might soon have been expedited their frolic in the blood. As it was, a general rush was made to the doors, but the king had ordered them to be locked immediately upon his entrance, and at the dwarf's suggestion, the keys had been disposed with him. While the tumult was at its height, and each masquerader attentive only to his own safety, for, in fact, there was much real danger in the presence of the excited crowd. The chain by which the chandelier ordinarily hung, which had been drawn up on its removal, might have been seen very gradually to descend until its hook extremity came within feet of the floor. Soon after this, the king and his 7 friends, having reeled about the hall all directions, found themselves at length in the center, of course, in immediate contrast with the chain. While they were thus situated, the dwarf, who had followed noiselessly at the heels of the inciting them to keep up the commotion, took hold of their own chain, and at the intersection of the 2 portions which crossed the circle diametrically and at right all angles, here, with the rapidity of thought, he inserted the hook from which the chandelier had wont be depend, and in an instant, by some unseen agency, the chandelier chain was drawn up so far upward as to take the hook out of reach, and as inevitable consequence, to drag the orangutans together in close connection and face to face. The masqueraders by this time had recovered in some measure from their alarm, and beginning to regard the whole matter as a well-conceived pleasantry, set up a loud shout of laughter at the predicament of the apes. "Leave them to me!" now screamed Hop Frog, his shrill voice making itself easily heard through the din. "Leave them to me! I fancy I know them! If I can only get a good look at them, I can tell you who they are!" Here, scrambling over the heads of the crowd, he managed to get at the wall, when seizing the flambeau from the caryatides, he returned as he went to the entire of the room, leaped with agility of a monkey upon the king's head, and then hence clambered a few feet above the chain, holding down the torch to examine the group of orangutans, and still screaming, "I shall soon find out who they are!" And now, while taking the whole assembly, the apes included, were convulsed with laughter, the jester suddenly uttered a shrill whistle. When the chain flew violently up for leaving them suspended in midair between the skylight and the floor, Hop Frog, clinging to the chain as it rose, still maintained his relative position in respect to the 8 maskers, and still, as if nothing were the matter, continued to thrust his torch down toward them, as though endeavoring to discover who they were. So thoroughly astonished was the whole company at the ascent that a dead silence of about a minute's duration ensued. It was broken by just a low, harsh grating. A sound that had been heard before attracted the attention of the king and his counselors when the former threw the wine in Trippetta's face. But on the present occasion, there could be no question to where the sound issued. It came from the fanged-like teeth of the dwarf, who ground and gnashed them as he foamed at the mouth and glared with an expression of maniacal rage into the upturned countenances of the king and his 7 companions. "Aha!" said the length of the influential jester. "Aha! I begin to see who these people are now. Here, pretending to be scrutinizing the king closely, he held the flambeau to the flaxen coat which enveloped him and which instantly burst into a sheet of vivid flame. In less than half a minute, the whole 8 orangutans were blazing fiercely amid the shrieks and the multitude who gazed from below, horror-stricken and without the power to render them the slightest assistance. At length, the flames, suddenly increasing in virulence, forced the jester to climb higher up the chain to be out of the reach. And as he made this movement, the crowd again sank for a brief instant into silence. The dwarf seized this opportunity at once and spoke. "I now see distinctly," he said, "what manner of people these maskers are. They are a great king and his 7 privy counselors. A king who does not scruple to strike a defenseless girl, and his 7 counselors who abet him in this outrage. As for myself, I am simply Hop Frog, the jester. And this is my last jest." A wing to the high convulsivity of both flax and tar to which it adhered, the dwarf had scarcely made an end of his brief speech before the work of vengeance was complete. The 8 corpses hung from the chains, swinging, blackened, hideous, an indistinguishable mass. The cripple hurled his torch at them, clambered leisurely to the ceiling, and disappeared into the skylight. It was supposed that Trippetta, stationed on the roof of the saloon, had been his accomplice for her friend in the fiery revenge, and that together they effected their escape to their own country, for neither was ever seen again.